Easter is over. The stone has been rolled away. Now what? What does this mean for us? We can learn from Jesus' first appearance, his last appearance, and we can look toward his final appearance in great anticipation.
Well, good morning and welcome to SouthCrest. How's everybody doing today? Wow, that's actually pretty good for a rainy Sunday morning. So glad you guys are here, that you made it. We have a great day planned for you today. We are finishing up our series called Now What? And in this sermon series, we took a look at Easter, and then we said, what did Jesus do after Easter? So the first week we looked at when he came back and when he talked to his disciples and gave them those final instructions on what they needed to do, right? We talked about the Great Commission. We talked about reaching other people for him. And then we talked about last week the ascension, Jesus going back into heaven. We talked about that implications to us, that because he's in heaven, he's with us now today, and that we can connect to him and be with him and have communion with him because of that. And today, we're going to look at him coming back, his return, what we call the second coming. And we'll see how his second coming should affect our lives and the choices that we make each day. Now, a few years back, I was coaching Benjamin's soccer team. And he was playing U12 soccer at the time. And the team that we had, we were doing really good. As a matter of fact, we had not lost a single game so far that season. And it wasn't just that we weren't losing games. We would go ahead and get ahead early in that game. And then we just maintained that lead throughout the game. And as a coach, that's a great place to be and a bad place to be. It's a great place to be because you're winning. And winning's cool. And it's a great place to be because you feel like as a coach, you're leading the kids well and teaching them how to play the game, and they're executing what you've taught them, and you feel things coming together. But it's also a bad place to be because every other team that plays against you has it out for you. It's like you're painting a big bullseye target on your back. It's a bad place to be because your kids, if you're not careful, can become overconfident or arrogant and think they're better than everybody else. And that can lead to trouble. And we were about halfway through the season, and we were playing a team that we had beaten previously quite considerably. And my worst fears came true. As this game started, we weren't scoring. And at halftime, the other team was beating us 2-0. I mean, when we came off the field at halftime, our kids just kind of jogged off like normal. The other kids were like sprinting and jumping and skipping. Like, we got the number one team beat. We were beating the best team. They were so excited. So I gently pulled my team off to the sideline and had a nice little soothing chat with them. No, not at all. That is false, okay? As a matter of fact, I think the best way to describe the conversation is parents on the opposite sideline. One of them asked another one, what do you think he's saying over there? And one of the dads was like, I don't know whatever it is, but he's chewing them out. And that's what I was doing. I was chewing them out. You see, we were in a game at that moment where my best scorer decided to become the best passer in the universe, and he was not shooting at all. And then the kids who were shooting really weren't shooting. They were just kicking a ball in the direction of a goal, I think. They had no clue. And then we made some mistakes down on our end and gave the ball up and gave some easy goals up. And so I was not pleased. And I let the kids know I was not pleased. I told the kids, hey, that other team came off boasting and bragging. They're beating you. And guess what? To their credit, they were beating us. They were playing the best game they'd ever had. And so after telling each kid what they had done wrong and what they could do better in the second half, as we were heading out, I grabbed my best scorer and I pulled him aside. His name was Bradley. I said, hey, Bradley, you're a nice kid. And I like it when you share, but I'm sick of it. So what I need you to do, and Josh, correct me if I'm wrong on this, because Josh Sells was my assistant coach. I said, Bradley, I want you to score 3 goals in the first 5 minutes of the second half. And he looked at me and goes, yes, sir. You know what he did? He scored 3 goals in the first 5 minutes of that second half, and we didn't look back after that. And they didn't score on us again. And we had a comeback. And it was a great feeling to have that comeback. But I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't want to be in that situation in the first place. Like, what is your experience with comebacks, right? It always depends on what side of the equation you're on, right? If your team is the one coming back, it is exhilarating. It is fantastic. But if your team is the one who's getting come back on, that really stinks. When you have the lead and you blow it and you lose it. By the way, in life, in sports, there are no ties. You know that, right? The team that was ahead and they got tied against, they lost. That's how that works. I'm sorry. There are no such things as ties in sports. If you were leading and then you ended up with a tie, you lost the game because you let them come back to tie you. So you've got to play that game to win it. And so we look at comebacks in this interesting and unique light because it's kind of like, hey, what are we going to do to come back? How are we going to push forward to overcome this where we find ourselves behind, right? And that's where we find ourselves right now. Because when a comeback happens, there's all kinds of emotions that happen with it. There can be this, excitement, this anxiousness as you're waiting and watching. Have you ever experienced that before? I stopped watching college football years ago. It was probably 12, 13 years ago that I stopped watching college football. It was late one night, Michigan was playing Notre Dame, and I turned on the TV. There was like 4 minutes left to go in that game. And Notre Dame was winning by a few points. Michigan walks down the field, scores a touchdown. I'm like, yes, fantastic. Over the next 4 minutes, there's about 5 more touchdowns. I had a heart attack. Notre Dame came right back down and scored. And I was like, oh, and then we came back down and scored. I was like, hey, back and forth, back and forth. I turned that TV off after that game. Michigan did win the game, so it was all good. But I looked at Angie and said, I'm never watching college football again. Except for last year when Ohio State played Michigan and we beat them for the second time in a row, soundly. I did watch that one. But again, at halftime we were down, and then we came back, and we came back in a big way. And so, for all my Ohio State people, I got you, Robert. It's good. It's good. It's all good. But there's emotions there. And if you're on the losing side of that, there's emotions there too. There's just like, come on, do something. You begin to panic. You begin to force things to happen that shouldn't happen. And you can find yourself in a very negative place. And the older I get, the more I feel like comebacks have passed me by. Like when I was younger, there was opportunity for that. Now I'm just too old and tired to try to come back. It's just like, hey, it's all good. All right, I lost. No big deal, right? We just get a different mindset. But when we get suffering in our lives, when hard things happen in our lives, we can fall into that place of, you know what, that's just the way it's going to be. But as followers of Jesus, we should never have that mindset because there's a comeback. And it's when Jesus comes back. And Jesus takes away all suffering and all pain and all losses. He comes back and he says, hey, I have this covered. And that's the comeback that we get to look forward to. Theologians call it the second coming when he comes again. It's the moment when history ends, when all time stops. Jesus promises, and he's going to come to return to save his people and gather them back to himself. And so today I want to look at a few Bible verses. There's a lot of stuff in Scripture about Jesus' return. We're going to look at a few of them, kind of break this down a bit, and just see what it might actually look like. So let's dive into these passages and see what the Bible has to say about Jesus' comeback, his return, his victory at the end here. We're going to pick up in John 14. It says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Now, most of you have heard that verse, that passage. Unfortunately, most of you have only heard that passage at a funeral. You hear that when someone you care about, someone you loved, has passed away. And usually a pastor will read that verse because it brings hope that Jesus is coming for you. Now here's the thing. That verse does bring encouragement and hope in those moments, but that's not why this passage was written. This passage was not written after someone had passed away. This passage was written as Jesus was trying to do something different with his disciples. You see, he wasn't trying to console them. He wasn't trying to make everything look okay for them in that moment. No, what Jesus was doing when he said these verses was he was encouraging his disciples. He was building them up. He was saying, hey, I'm about to go. I haven't gone yet, but when I do go, don't worry, I'm coming back. And so you can take heart, you can take faith in the fact that I am leaving, and you can do what I've asked you to do because, hey, I'm coming back for you, no cap. Okay, he says, I am coming forward. I'm looking for you, and I'm going to make an impact in your lives. This is a promise. He promised them, hey, stay strong. I will come back for you. But there's more to it than that, right? It's more than just a promise. Let's look at Matthew, what Matthew has to say about this. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you may also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Jesus is teaching and tells us nobody, not even him as the Son, knows the day or the hour of the return. But only the Father in heaven knows that. You see, uncertainty in life can cause us stress and doubt. When we don't know what's happening, we begin to question what's happening. And that can put us in a place where we're not doing well. But I love what Charles Schulz, the writer of Peanuts, had to say. He said this. He said, don't be worried about the world coming to an end today. It's already tomorrow in Australia. That's true, right? I know people who are so focused on predicting when Jesus is coming back. Right? If you read in the book of Revelation, there's all kind of prophecies about how bad the world's going to be before he comes back. And so people try to force what's happening in the world today into that mold. Can I share something with you? Back in the 70s when I grew up, there was this really, really, really bad recession. Like gas prices were like astronomical. They're like 75 cents. People were losing their mind. They had to pay that much for gas. And they said the world's coming to an end. Back in the 80s, when I was living in the Detroit area and the Tigers won the World Series in '84, just throwing that out there for anybody who needs information, there were things happening in the world at that time that people were like, you know what? The world's coming to an end. How about the 90s? That was a hot mess. World's coming to an end. The 2000s, we had 9/11. World's coming to an end. Guys, every single decade, every single year, there are things that happen where people say, hey, guess what? The world's coming to an end. Guess what has yet to happen? The world coming to an end. We can't focus so much of our time thinking only the Father knows. We should spend that time doing what God's called us to do. We're told to be ready. To be ready. Parents, when you're having your babies, what do they call the bags that you pack and put by the door? They're called ready bags, right? Because you're ready. At any moment when that water breaks, you grab that bag and you go to the hospital and you have everything you need because you're ready. That's what God's telling us to do. Be ready. You don't know when he's coming, so be ready all the time. Be prepared every moment. The Bible says, hey, it's important that you know your status with the Father, that you're connected and you know what's going on. Because in that instant, there'll be 2 dudes working in the field, one will disappear, one won't. Now listen, I am sure that both of the men working in that field are good men. They're hard workers. They treat their families well. They love people well. The difference in those 2 men is one's depending on goodness to get him to heaven, and the other one's depending on grace to get him into heaven. And it's by grace you are saved, not through works. And so you need to be ready by knowing your status with the Father. You need to be ready because when he comes, you need to be on his team. The Bible also tells us this, Matthew 24. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. I want you to notice the response to the coming of the King. It says in the Bible that it's going to be mourning, weeping. C.S. Lewis summed it up this way. For the first time, it will be God without disguise. Something so overwhelming that it will strike either irresistible love or irresistible horror into every creature. It will be too late then to choose your side. You see, when Jesus returns, he's returning for judgment. He's returning to say who followed me and who didn't. And get this, every single person who's ever lived will face the judgment of God. Every single one. You and I will each stand before God. And God's going to pull out this book. It's not going to be a small book. It's going to be a big book for me. And it's going to be, this is all the stupid things Pete Shoger did. Okay? There might be volumes. I don't know. It might be more than one book. But he's going to pull that joker out. And he's going to say, Pete, let's start talking through this. And as he goes to point one, I'm not going to have to say a word because Jesus is going to jump in front. Hey, Dad, whoa, hey, just a second. Hey, remember when you sent me to earth and there was a cross and I died on it and then I rose again? You remember that? And God's going to be like, yeah, I remember that. He's like, yeah, well, there was a purpose for that, remember? And this one here, this guy Pete, I know he's an idiot, but I died for him. And I got this one. And God's going to be like, well done. Enter in. You see, that's what's going to happen. Everybody's going to be judged. But Jesus took that from us. And so for those who aren't ready, though, for those who haven't accepted Christ, they're going to look over at Jesus because they've seen him jumping in for everybody else. He's going to be like, I don't even know who you are. But I went to church every Sunday. Great. You also went to Wendy's afterwards. You're not a cheeseburger. You're not a follower of me. So, I mean, hey, sorry. It is what it is. It's that relationship piece. Because in a relationship, you know one another. And when you're in a relationship with Christ, Jesus says, I know you, I'll step in front for you. But if you don't have a relationship, he's like, I don't know who you are. I'm sorry, and you got to face God. And that is not a place that I want to be. So let's make sure that we're ready. So understanding this fact that Jesus is coming back. It's not a question of will he. He is coming back. What do you need to do today to prepare for his return, right? What do we need to do as people who say we're followers of Christ need to do? Even when we don't know when it's going to be. I'll take care of that tomorrow. No, there is no tomorrow. You have today. I think there's three things that we need to do to prepare for his return. The first is this. Pursue Christ-likeness now. 1 John 3, 2-3 puts it this way. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. And everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure. These verses point to the way that we should live our lives now. That we should strive to be pure. We should strive to be like him. The choices that we make every single day says a lot about what we believe. It says a lot about who we are. When you make a choice and people watch you make those choices, do they look at you and say, that's a follower of Jesus? I can tell by the choices they make that they follow after Jesus. Or do the decisions you make, people are like, what's that guy doing? I have no clue. Because if you say you're a follower of Jesus and you're making choices contrary to that, that's not a good place to be. Look, none of us are perfect. But the question isn't about being perfect. The question is, am I better today than I was yesterday? Hey, am I better today than I was last week? Am I better today than I was last year? In other words, is there movement in my life towards becoming more pure, to becoming better. Tim Keller kind of summed it up this way. God's kingdom is present in its beginnings, but still future in its fullness. This guards us from an under-realized eschatology. Eschatology is a big fancy word that talks about when Jesus comes back, okay? In other words, expecting no change now. Some of us, when we accept Christ, like, hey, that's good, I'm done. There's no change. Oh, well, it didn't work. And the other fear is an over-realized eschatology. That's expecting all change now. That's expecting that Jesus saved me, boom, all of a sudden we're perfect and we're holy and everything's perfect with us. Neither of those things happen. But what instead should happen is the reality that while we're not yet what we will be, we're also no longer what we used to be. When you decide to go on a trip and you leave LaGrange, you're really far away from your destination. But every step you take towards your destination, you're now closer to that destination than you once were before. You're no longer where you were, you're no longer in LaGrange, but you're still not where you're supposed to be. And it's in that journey we call life that we should see these improvements made. Hey, I'm not the guy I used to be. Here's what I'm aiming for. I'm not there yet, but I'm still aiming for that. And I'm still pursuing that. And that's what I want to be. Our lives should be evident there's growth in it. Listen, if we really want to be like Jesus, by seeing him when he comes, we'll pursue being like him now. If I put on Christ now, then when he comes, he'll be like, I recognize that because that's me. Come. We have a job to do. No matter how hard we try, we will never be perfect and holy. And listen, if we never try to be more like him, we won't. That's the guarantee. But that's no excuse not to become better or to try harder to be more righteous. Practice makes better. And that is what he asks us to do. Hey, to live a life pursuing after me. Yeah, you're going to have some bumps in the road, but pursue after me. Let's keep on moving. The second thing we can do to prepare for the second coming is this. Ready ourselves for suffering. You're like, well, that's a fantastic warm fuzzy point. Yeah. Hey, unfortunately, in the Bible, it promises a couple things. And one of them is suffering. 1 Peter 4:12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. In other words, when bad things happen, you should be like, what happened? You should be like, oh yeah, here it came. Okay? And then in Acts, it tells us similarly, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. With this suffering in mind, because suffering is guaranteed, with it in mind, we should get ready for the Lord's coming by being spiritually and mentally alert to things in our lives that can lead to suffering. We should be careful and discerning when it comes to the devil and his deception and false teaching. You need to understand what it is you're doing before you go do it. It's real simple. We need to submit to the word of God in our lives. We need to let that be our barometer to follow after him, rather than being lawless or self-willed. And we should be cultivating strong faith in the goodness of God so that when, not if, suffering comes, so when that suffering comes, we don't question, does God really love us? When bad things happen to people, the question I get more than any others is, why would a loving God let this happen to me? It's a real simple answer. They don't want to hear it in that moment, but it's sin. Because you live in a state of constant rebellion against a loving God. Like, I love my kids. But something I've learned is there's some things I can't teach my kids. The only way they're going to learn it is by making that mistake. All I can do is try to protect them from too much bad consequences. I can tell my kids all day, I did when they were younger, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. Guess what every single one of my kids did at some point in their life? Reach out and touch the stove. All right? Now, most of them, they'll like leave their hand there for 5 minutes, like, oh, wait, that is hot, yeah, But they do it. I can tell them all day long not to sin, not to sin, not to sin, but the only way they're going to learn not to sin some sins is by committing those sins. And then they realize, that was really stupid. I'm not going to do that again. And so God allows suffering because we sinned against him. We brought that into the world. But because he allows it doesn't mean he's happy with it. I'm not happy my kids didn't listen to me and not touch the stove. I'm happy they don't continue to touch the stove now that they learned their lesson. But I wish they just would have listened to me the first time. And so bad things happen to us. Because it's only through his strength, leaning on his promises, and trusting in him solely that we can overcome the sin in our lives and any suffering that comes our way. And just a word about how this applies today. Perhaps more than any other time in history, mankind has developed a popular as well as intellectual and sophisticated way of denying the existence of any divine law or standard. In other words, the absolute truth for most people is there are no absolute truths. In other words, people say, if it feels good, do it. Hey, that's your truth. You live it out. Y'all, that's not the first time you've heard those things. It's inundated all into our world over and over again. We have found a way to claim plausibility for creating our own truth, creating our own right and wrong, creating our own identity. For example, push some buttons, but I like pushing buttons. If you were born a man and you say you're a woman, in today's world, that's fine because that's your truth, right? There is no law in God. There is no law in nature. There's no law in culture to hinder you. You can never do what you want to do, right? You're a law to yourself. But that's what Jesus calls lawlessness. Because Jesus created you fearfully and wonderfully. He had plans for you before you were even thought of. He had plans for you before your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents were ever thought of. And he created you specifically for a purpose, on purpose. And we make choices every single day, some big, some small in our eyes against God. That's all sin. That pushes back against his law and his truth and says, God, we know better. God, you made a mistake when you made me. God, don't make mistakes. We make them all the time. You don't have to like what I'm saying. Doesn't bother me at all. It's in the Bible. And I follow that. So you have an issue, take it up with Jesus. He'll talk to you about it. I want you to understand something. We need to prepare for God's second coming. And when Jesus says that such lawlessness is going to increase, be multiplied, the effect of that tragic increase in that sin is coldness in our love for other people. So one way we need to prepare for the second coming and its suffering is that we need to submit ourselves to God's law and standards. 2 Corinthians 4:16-18 puts it this way. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are not unseen are eternal. When we suffer for God, he promises to renew us and strengthen us. And in his strength, we can prepare for his return and bring glory to him. And the last way we prepare for the coming of Christ is to work faithfully for Christ. Over and over and over in the New Testament, it says we're to be watchful, to be awake, to be ready. So what does that mean? How do we get ready, right? By working hard and diligently at what God called you to do. He designed you for a purpose, on purpose, and he wants you to do something there. And for each of us, that's going to be different, right? God has given us all assignments while he's gone. On top of that, God has provided you gifts. He's provided you talents. He's provided you resources. He's provided you everything you need to get the job done that he asked you to do, to stay the course, to follow him. When the Bible tells us to watch, it means to do your jobs for the sake of Christ, to do your jobs well. To work means to step forward and to pursue after him. Look, you have an assignment, and God's not interested in whether or not you complete that assignment. He's interested are you doing it? Are you following what I asked you to do? We're just supposed to work every day until he tells us to do something different. To continue to follow after him, to be his hands and feet. Look, I don't know about you, But when Christ comes again, I want to be found with working man's hands. Hands that are calloused. Hands that are brittle and wrinkled because they've worked hard their whole lives. I want Jesus to see those hands and say, hey, I recognize those hands. They look like my son's hands. They're full of hard work. That's what I want Jesus to see. That I did my best for him. Look, as we close today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Today we're going to celebrate communion. And communion is a time when we come together and remember what Jesus did for us on the cross. Remember what Easter was all about. And there's a reason for why we're doing this today. And the reason's this. When Paul was instructing the church how to take communion, he told them a very important part of that. 1 Corinthians 11:26 says this. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until what? He comes. He said, you're going to do this until he comes again. And so I thought it was appropriate with us talking about him coming again that we should do something to remind ourselves that, hey, he is coming again. You see, the communion is about looking back on what Jesus offered up, but it's also about looking forward to, we're doing this because he told us to, because he's coming again. And this in itself helps us to remember who he is and what he's done for us. Helps us to connect to him in a very different way. It's a tool that helps us to prepare for that day when he says, you know what? I'm coming back to receive you to myself. The purpose is to focus us, to remind us that, hey, you're not working in vain. But I said that if I go prepare a place for you, I'll come again and receive you to myself. That where I am, you may be also.